Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to this week's edition of Tasting Together. My name is Pat Fahey. I'm a Master Cicerone. I'm Content Director for the Cicerone Certification Program. And this week we're going to be talking about Sweet Stout. Yeah, we had a brief internet moment over here. It wasn't getting started right away, but looks like we're good to go. So, as with every time that we do this, or every week that we do Tasting Together, we're getting together to talk about some topic from the general canon of beer topics. In a lot of cases, it's going to be talking about a specific beer style. Follow that up with any questions that you guys have about that topic to make sure that that you guys get as much out of this as possible. And then also, hopefully, you're joining us with a beer in hand, because I know that if I was going to listen to myself talk for 45 minutes, I would want to be drinking a beer during that. So, cheers. If you're coming back, last week we talked about Goza, and that was a lot of fun. If you didn't get a chance to check that out, go ahead and take a look at it. If it's your first time here, I always like to say, make sure that you ask questions as we're going. I won't necessarily get to them right when you ask them, but I'll do my best to get through all of the questions before the end of the session. Just want to make sure that you guys get your burning Sweet Stout questions all covered. Then the only other order of business before we get started is just to talk about the schedule for the next couple of weeks. Next week, we are taking the week off. So, still feel free to sit down, drink a beer at 4 p.m. on Wednesday, but, you'll just have to do it without us for that week. Following week, Neil is going to be here, and he's going to be talking about Fest beer and Märzen. So little Oktoberfest fix, even though we unfortunately don't have real Oktoberfest happening this year. And then the last one we have on the schedule currently is October 7th. I'll be back, and I'll be doing American barley wine, which should be a lot of fun. I don't usually talk about the beer I got in advance, but I picked up some Anchor Old Foghorn the other day, and am looking forward to, I will be drinking it between now and then, in addition to drinking it when we have that session. So without further ado, let's just dive right in and talk about Sweet Stout. I think I have all of my beer poured in there. So this week I am drinking Left Hand's Milk Stout. I'm drinking their nitro version of it. They package both a regularly carbonated and a nitro version of it, and I felt like going the nitro route. If you haven't let us know already, give us a shout out. I see some Firestone Merlin in there, which is a beer that I love very much. Double cream stout from Bell's. A lot of good stuff going on in the comments. In terms of glassware, this is a style with British roots, and so ideally, you'd probably want to serve this in some sort of British-ish glass. Like, I'm thinking something along the lines of like a tulip pint, or which is the, tulip pint is the shape that the classic Guinness glass is, that kind of like curve taper glass, or like a pub mug or a Nonic pint, something along those lines. I set it over there. I have like New Glarus Nonic pints, and I was like, if I hold my hand just right, I can cover up the logo. I just feel weird about being on camera drinking a beer out of another brewery's branded glassware. When I'm at home normally, that's not a big deal at all, but just in this setting, I try to match if I'm gonna do branded glassware at all. So I went with the unbranded tulip. Definitely not classic, but super functional. It's a glass I love. Anybody who's been here more than a couple times already knows that. So Let's talk a little bit about the history of this style. Like most stouts and porters, this beer was born in the UK and born out of the development and popularity of the porter style. From what I've read, the first milk stouts that came into being were produced in England in, I think, 1907. A brewery called Mackeson's there began producing a milk stout. And the reason they called it a milk stout was because they brewed it with lactose, or they added lactose to the recipe. Lactose is also known as, lactose is the sugar that's found in milk. And so sometimes it is referred to as milk stout, or sorry, milk sugar. My words, they fail me sometimes. So anyways, Mackeson's, 1907, they make this milk stout beer with lactose. I don't know, probably even at that time, that was around the time when beer started to become lower in alcohol in the UK. You see this sort of slide from the beginning of the 20th century where a lot of beer would have clocked in like the 6 to 8% alcohol range. And then after temperance movement there and a couple of world wars and some rationing, like we get to where we are today, where a lot of beer in the UK is more in the 3 to 4% alcohol range. But when this beer was first being produced, it was produced at about 3% alcohol, which my understanding is at the time that would have been distinctly lower in alcohol content than most other beer that was on the market. And so one of the ways that this brand was marketed was as sort of like a nutritious beer that was fit for nursing mothers or athletes or other people that, still wanted to drink beer, but needed to drink it take it in a nutritious way. And so the style grew in popularity over the first half of the 20th century and reached its peak in popularity somewhere shortly after World War II. But not too long after that began to decline in popularity to the point where I believe you can still find Mackeson's stouts in some places, but the style, like a lot of styles over time, kind of died out. It definitely dropped in terms of how popular it was. However, the style found some amount of popularity in other parts of the world. One of the things that every time I do one of these, I always do a bit of research leading up to it. I have pretty good comfortability with most of the styles that are out there, having had to take like tests and write educational materials for several years on all of these things. But I always like to do a little bit of extra research just to make sure that everything is on point. And I always learn a couple of like new and interesting tidbits. One of the things that I learned when I was researching this style is that it actually is like fairly popular in South Africa. In 2003, South African breweries began producing a beer called Castle Milk Stout. And I think to this day, that beer is still produced and is still reasonably popular in like 9 or so countries in the south of Africa. So interesting to see that it has a hold in that part of the world, which I would not have necessarily expected. Outside of there, like we've seen, or like we see with a lot of styles that were popular in the UK and then sort of diminished in popularity there, but sprung up elsewhere. A lot of American brewers have sort of taken this style, embraced it, and we see it brewed a lot more often in the US than we do in the UK at this point in time. Like I said, I'm drinking Left Hand's Milk Stout. I don't know that I wouldn't necessarily say that they were the first to do it. They may have been, I'm not sure. But I would consider them to be probably the most prominent example of the style produced in the US. There are a number of other breweries that make them. We mentioned some of them, Bell's and Firestone Walker, and I've had milk stouts and sweet stouts from a large number of breweries in the U.S. over the years, but I would say Left Hand is kind of like the standard bearer for the style here in the U.S. So, one of the things that is interesting about sweet stouts is that, and I've already sort of alluded to this, we oftentimes see the inclusion of a unique ingredient in this style. And one of the things that I'd like to address whenever I talk about this style is, what makes a sweet stout? Does a sweet stout need to have some sort of sweetener added to it? Does it need to be made with lactose? The answer is no. The overarching idea behind a sweet stout is that it is a stout, a darker roasty beer that is balanced more towards sweetness than it is towards bitterness and roastiness. And some breweries will accomplish that without the use of adding something like lactose. In a lot of cases, sweet stouts are also going to be hopped a little bit more lowly than other stout sub-styles. And that is going to enhance the perception of sweetness. But most sweet stouts that I can think of, Shayna mentioned right now that she threw out to me in our chat that Bell's Double Cream Stout does not actually have any lactose in it. So there's an example of a sweet stout that is made without lactose. Most of them are made with lactose, though. And lactose is worth talking about a little bit because it's kind of it's a special ingredient when it comes to beer production. So lactose, milk sugar. When you compare it to other common sugars like glucose or glucose, which is like corn sugar, or if you see something labeled as dextrose, that's glucose. Sucrose is another common sugar, that's table sugar. When you compare lactose to those two sugars, it's significantly less sweet by weight, but still does provide some amount of sweetness. But the bigger deal with lactose when it comes to beer production is that standard Saccharomyces yeast cannot ferment lactose. They cannot break lactose down. In other cases, when brewers add sugar to beer, if they're adding like candy sugar or corn sugar or simple sugar sources like honey, in most cases, those are nearly fully fermentable. The yeast is going to be able to chew through all of that sugar. And so rather than making a beer sweeter, in most cases, adding sugar tends to just boost the alcohol content and make the beer honestly a little bit more perceivably dry, meaning that it tastes less sweet. That's not the case with lactose. Saccharomyces, common yeast strains, cannot break lactose down, and so brewers can add it during the brewing process, and it remains throughout the process on into the finished beer. It's not as sweet as it would be if you had an equivalent amount of glucose or sucrose present in the beer, but it does contribute some sweetness and also adds a little bit to the body of the beer. It gives it a little bit fuller mouthfeel. One fun fact about lactose, I've said a couple times, standard brewing yeast cannot break lactose down. And that's like, your classic Saccharomyces strains. There are organisms that can break lactose down. In particular, one that comes to mind is Brettanomyces, which is wild yeast commonly used in mixed culture beers. I have specifically a recollection of judging a homebrew competition a lot of years ago where somebody entered like just kind of the specialty category. And they're like, you know what, I'm going to do something kind of off the wall. I'm going to make a milk stout, and then I'm going to bottle condition it with Brettanomyces. And I don't know if they just didn't know this or what, but as I mentioned, Brettanomyces, unlike Saccharomyces, can break down lactose. And so by the time that bottle got to us and we opened it at the table, it was horrifically overcarbonated. I mean, that was like open the cap and the beer, like, I don't think it hit the ceiling, but that bottle gushed pretty intensely. There was not a lot of beer, liquid beer left in the bottle when it got done kind of doing its thing. So if you are a home brewer out there and you're like, I think it'd be cool to make a Brett milk stout, I like your enthusiasm, but I would advise against it. So let's talk a little bit about the recipe for a sweet stout. You know, the grist is pretty similar to what you would see out of other sorts of stouts, except in terms of like a percentage perspective. You know, roasted malt is a little bit less emphasized than it is in other cases, but similar types of ingredients. You're going to see use of like pale ale malt for the base. Probably something like roasted barley or black patent malt to give it really dark color and some of that roast character. And then maybe a few different specialty grains. Could be chocolate malt, could be crystal malt or other specialty malts to, you know, round out the malt flavor profile of the beer. And then in addition to that, if it is a milk stout, it would also include lactose as part of the grist. I don't know if you would technically call that, I mean, it's not a grist ingredient because it doesn't go through the mill, and it also doesn't really get lumped in with fermentables because it's not fermentable, but as a sugar, I kind of think of it in the same realm as other sugar sources. When it comes to hops for the sweet stout style, I mentioned earlier, compared to other stout substyles, hopping is going to be a little bit lower on this style of beer. Typically very low or no hop aroma in these beers. So the varietal isn't quite as important, though, you know, most breweries are going to probably use English hops of some sort. You know, sweet stouts that I can think of that do have some amount of hop character to them oftentimes have a little bit of like a kind of like earthy herbal character to them, but that's rare. More likely you don't see very much at all in the way of hop flavor and aroma. When it comes to the yeast, I would imagine that you could probably get by with either an American ale yeast or an English ale yeast. You know, I'm not sure exactly what Left Hand uses. I would guess, because they do have a couple other flagships, or at least historically have had flagships that sort of fell into the English style of English styles of beer, like their Sawtooth, which was sort of ESB-esque. They used to have an English IPA that was part of their core lineup. So I think that their house yeast strain is more English than it is American, but fermentation is not usually a huge player in the flavor profile of this style either. It's really, you know, the flavor of sweet stouts is really driven by malt flavor characteristics, and then if lactose is being used, the addition of that lactose. One other thing that's worth mentioning is that a lot of times, at least today, sweet stouts end up getting nitrogenated. You know, historically, that was not necessarily the case. And from what I understand, that's more been kind of like an American innovation on the style, or an American introduction to the style, was saying like, hey, you know, nitrogenation is cool. Nitro beer has some great characteristics to it. Like, let's nitrogenate our sweet stouts. And I know Left Hand in particular did a ton of research to develop packaging that allowed them to produce a nitro beer without a widget like you see in Guinness cans or Guinness bottles. And nitrogenation does make some sense in these styles. I talked a fair amount about nitrogenation in beer when we did the session on Irish Stout several months ago. One of the key things that nitrogenation does for a beer, or nitrogenation compared with carbonation, is that carbonation has sort of a dampening effect on sweetness. When carbonation is present in a beverage, it reduces the perceived sweetness of a beer. We often interpret that as it making the beer seem more bitter, but usually it just seems more bitter through a reduction of the perceived sweetness. So in a beer like Sweet Stout, where one of the goals is to sort of highlight that perceived sweetness, it does make sense to use a different style of not carbonating the beer, but to carbonate it at a lower level and to nitrogenate it so that you could emphasize the sweetness present in the beer. And if you want to do like an interesting experiment, Left Hand does package both nitrogenated and regularly carbonated versions of the Sweet Stout. It's a really interesting tasting to try the two side by side and see how the different ways that they present. So let's see. Let's talk a little bit about the flavor of Sweet Stout. As I mentioned, this beer is primarily driven by its malt characteristics. One of the things that I commonly find with Sweet Stouts is that they have a little bit of like a coffee and cream profile to them, and I don't know if that's just the knowledge that it is like the name Milk Stout and the association with cream leading to that. But I think part of it is the fact that a lot of times Sweet Stouts are balanced in a way where the roast character is softer. And so, similar to adding cream to coffee as it sort of blunting that heavy roast character that you get in black coffee, there's sort of a similar effect here where you get a lighter roast character. So there's, in addition to that sort of like coffee and cream, there's a lot of times these beers will exhibit a wide range of different chocolate notes or cocoa notes. This one has sort of like a brownie batter, like chocolate cake sort of note to it. Maybe a little bit of like a cocoa powder note as well. A lot of different things in that general chocolate roast realm. Sometimes they'll show secondary malt notes as well, things like caramel or toast, other malt flavors, but usually that's where the majority of the flavor characteristics of the style lie. The other things that are kind of interesting and notable about this style, and I can say this more for the beer in front of me than I can style generally, because not all examples of the style are nitrogenated, but the nitrogenation definitely has a big impact on the mouthfeel of the beer. It's smoother, softer, the carbonation is lower. Compared with something like an Irish Stout, body is usually going to be a little bit fuller in this kind of beer, so that's a characteristic as well. One of the things that is kind of interesting about Left Hand's Milk Stout is that, like I mentioned, in general on Sweet Stout, one of the ways that brewers achieve that perceived sweetness is by lowering the bitterness that they target. In the realm of Sweet Stouts, Left Hand's Milk Stout is still pretty bitter. It's not like off the charts, but from a balance perspective, this beer does still have a pretty significant amount of bitterness to it. So, this one doesn't go quite as far in that direction of just overt sweetness. I'll talk a little bit about styles, to talk about similar styles. I already mentioned Irish Stout, but that's one of the most common comparisons, and especially you'll see people stack up like Guinness against Left Hand's Milk Stout because I don't know this for sure, but if I had to guess, I would say that they're probably the two most widely available nitrogenated products in the US. And so it's fair to ask how they are different. And key differences between them, Guinness or Irish Stout in general is going to be thinner, drier, so a lot less perceivably sweet, usually more perceivably bitter. And then, the body element is just a lot thinner of a beer compared to something like this. In addition to the way it's brewed, the addition of lactose ups the perceived fullness of the body. Comparing it to something like an oatmeal stout, that could be hard to say. Oatmeal stout, outside of the fact that it has oats in it, allows for a pretty wide spectrum of variation. So you can have oatmeal stouts that are very dry. You can have oatmeal stouts that are pretty sweet. And oats in general tend to add sort of like a silky or kind of a luscious texture to beer. It can be a slightly different texture when you compare it to the texture that lactose gives to beer. But if you have an oatmeal stout that's really sweet, it would be pretty difficult to distinguish that from a sweet stout. So definitely a lot of overlap between those two styles from a flavor perspective. They're obviously made in different ways, but when I talk about style comparisons, I'm often thinking about them through the lens of if you had to taste them blind and didn't know which style it was, what could you look for? And in some cases, you could find an oatmeal stout and a sweet stout that tasted almost identically. The one other stout that I like to mention in here is tropical stout. And you don't see a ton of tropical stouts, but it's an interesting style. I'd say like Lion Stout is one of the best known examples of it. And it's an awesome beer if you can dig it up. Tropical stout is interesting because it is the one stout that is sort of balanced similarly to a sweet stout. Out of all of the stout styles, most of them are balanced more towards dryness and more towards heavy roast. And tropical stout also is a little bit more balanced towards sweetness, and the roast character is a little bit softer. But the big differences between like a sweet stout and a tropical stout is going to be higher in alcohol, usually by 1.5 to 2 percentage points. So like more intense overall. And then also tropical stout also usually brings some additional fruit character to the beer. Usually overt fruitiness is more prominent in a tropical stout than it is in something like a sweet stout. So last but not least, I want to talk quick about pairings with sweet stout, and then I'm going to take the questions that have come through so far. And if people have any other questions, be sure to put them out there so that I can help you lay to rest any of your burning sweet stout questions. So when it comes to pairing, like other stouts, beer obviously presents with some amount of roast character, which makes it well suited to match up against things that have like Maillard browning. Makes a nice match against things like steak or short rib. Barbecue, I think in general, can play really nicely off of this. I think I saw somebody mention it in the comments, something about Vindaloo, but one of the things that I think sweet stout is really good for is pairing with spicy food, because like we talked about in the session that we did on pairing with spicy food, one of the things that can help to mitigate spice a little bit is sweetness. And this beer naturally has some amount of sweetness to it. So I think about any spice dish that would take well to roast character probably would play nicely with sweet stout, and the barbecue comment is kind of in line with that. If you had something barbecued that also featured a fair amount of spice, I think this beer would work really nicely with it. The other place that I think sweet stouts are really well suited to is dessert. One of the things is that when you know, most desserts are sweet. And when you pair with something that is sweet, if the beer doesn't have very much sweetness to it, sometimes if the contrast gets to be too excessive or too intense, it can make the beer seem really dry or even kind of like unpleasant in bringing its bitterness out. So, you know, I think that this beer is really well suited for a lot of different types of dessert pairing. I've said this in the past. In general, I usually steer away from doing chocolate and stouts just because I don't find it to be interesting enough. It's rarely is it bad, but it's usually just kind of like, yeah, you know, the chocolate tastes like chocolate and the beer tastes like chocolate, and that's cool. But like it's not usually going to like blow anyone's socks off. So if I was doing a pairing that involved chocolate with this beer, I would probably want to see some other elements present in the dessert. Like if it was like a German chocolate cake that featured like coconut and kind of, you know, the sweetened condensed milk flavor that you get in that kind of cake, or a chocolate dish that incorporated caramel into it, or, you know, I think those things could offer enough of a difference that it might work interestingly with this beer. However, I prefer to steer away from chocolate and go towards, like, I put this up against more vanilla focused dessert. So something like a creme brulee, or maybe, you know, coconut and chocolate as natural pairing. If you had like coconut macaroons, or fruit too. I think fruit and chocolate are pretty natural pairings. So something like cherry cobbler, like any of those sorts of things, I think would work really well with this sort of beer. I don't know if I said matchy out loud, so I appreciate people saying it for me. That's great. So that is kind of all that I had prepared to say about this. Let me look to the questions and see if I can help you guys out. So Tom asked, why would you want to make a sweet stout without lactose? I saw some people mentioning potential vegan concerns. That may be a thought for some breweries. I'm not sure if there's I'm not sure on that front, but you know, some brewers may just not want to use the added ingredient, or might want to make the beer in a way where they didn't have to rely on that ingredient. They might find that they're able to make a beer that falls in this general profile where they really like the characteristics of it, and they do it without using lactose. So, you know, I don't have like an awesome answer to that question, but it's the same reason why, you know, a brewer might make any beer without using some specific ingredient. They may I remember reading really long time ago Garrett Oliver talking about how he formulated Brooklyn's black chocolate stout, and was like really hyped about the fact that he was able to produce this beer that was incredible, had this incredible depth of chocolate character to it, but didn't use chocolate in the production. You know, brewers can use chocolate to make beer, but you know, it's kind of cool to be able to elicit those same flavors or those characteristics without using that ingredient. So I can imagine a brewer approaching this style in the same way, saying, you know, we want to make a style that, or a beer that has those traits, but we don't want to lean on lactose to accomplish that. And there are other ways that you can get those characteristics. Let's see. Michael asked, what would the flavor profile be on a Brett milk stout? So, you know, one, you'd get some amount of Brett character. You'd get some amount of that kind of like horse blanket, funky characteristic, and it would depend how long you allowed the maturation to go on for, in terms of how that flavor would develop. But one of the big things on it is, when a brewer formulates a milk stout, they formulate it to be skewed towards sweetness, but still balanced in that regard. It's still constructed as a well-balanced beer with that lactose, with the amount of lactose that they're using matched up against the amount of bitterness that they're using. And the thing is if you use Brett in either the fermentation or in bottle conditioning that beer, it's going to chew through all of that lactose. And so the bigger issue is that unless you, did it very carefully, like, you end up with a beer that is very, very unbalanced, that is much less sweet than you would have intended. And since the bread is going to be able to chew through all of that lactose, there's not a huge reason to use it in the first place. So the whole idea of a Brett milk stout, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Brett stouts, I've seen a few breweries do those sorts of things, and you can get certain characteristics there, but Brett milk stout is just it's not really logical. It doesn't really make sense as a way that you would approach trying to achieve a certain set of characteristics in a beer. Michael also asked, if you use lactose in the brew, is it still vegan even if the lactose is used up in the fermentation? So I think I mentioned this up front, but Saccharomyces yeasts, like standard yeasts that would be used to make a beer like this, do not consume lactose. The lactose remains in the beer on into the finished beer. So the beer still very much contains lactose at the end. The only way you would have the lactose consumed during fermentation is if you used other sorts of organisms that were able to ferment that lactose. Someone asked if a nitro beer would ever show up on a tasting exam. Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Especially for styles like Irish Stout, and even styles like Sweet Stout. Irish Stout for sure is more commonly available and more commonly encountered packaged as a nitro beer. And I would say Milk Stout or Sweet Stout probably also is more commonly packaged as a nitro beer, though I could be wrong on that. It's a little bit, it's more split on that. I can think of a lot of regularly carbonated versions of Sweet Stout, whereas the Irish Stout style is so dominated by Guinness, and Guinness is packaged nitrogenated, Guinness Draft at least. But yes, to answer that question, absolutely, nitro beers can show up on tasting exams. Let's see. Greg asked if I could describe how Left Hand packages a nitro version without a widget. What Shayna told me was that there's a pretty interesting video on the Left Hand website that sort of talks about how they do it. And I haven't seen that video, so I can't say for sure. But my understanding is that they don't go into really great detail in terms of how they achieve a nitrogenated beer in that way. And one of the reasons is that, when they released this beer packaged this way, they talked a lot about how they sunk millions of dollars into research to figure out how to do it. And so they have a proprietary method that they use, and they haven't really told people how they do it. And it's kind of the same thing with Guinness. Guinness pioneered they pioneered the nitrogenated pour. And it is a proprietary method, and they don't really tell people how they do it. So that's one of the things, when I remember this like when I was trying to learn more about this as a beer learning person, which I still am. And like there's not a lot of great resources out there in terms of how to nitrogenate beer. I tell this story a lot, but I remember talking to Neil about it because Neil is like my draft guru, because he should be everyone's draft guru. And I asked him, I was like, what do you know about how breweries nitrogenate their beer? And he was like, it's kind of like he worked at Boulevard for a very, very long time. And he said, even at Boulevard, which is a large and well-established beer, like brewery with good process control and a lot of knowledge there, he was like, even when we would do like our nitro beers, it was kind of like we didn't know for sure that it would work until we tested it. He said what they would do is they would use their method, and then they would package a couple kegs off, run it over to their draft system and test it. And if it cascaded, then they'd be like, cool, it worked. And then they'd package it. So I'm not exactly sure. I don't know that even in that video that kind of covers that video from Left Hand, I don't know that they get into the nitty gritty of like how they actually perform the nitrogenation. Let's see. So we had a couple of people ask about Tropical Stout. Yeah, the naming for Tropical Stout comes from the fact that the style was commonly produced in various tropical regions. When you look, it's very interesting. Like if you go to parts of the Caribbean today, for example, you would think that everybody would drink just light lagers, and in a lot of cases they do. But I remember shopping for beer on a trip to the Caribbean, and like outside of international pale lager, light lager kind of styles, the only other beer I found was Guinness Foreign Extra Stout, which is like an 8% alcohol, like pretty heavy stout. So I'm not exactly sure what it is about that style, but there's something about that style that like resonates with tropical culture. I think it's Lion Stout that is Lion Stout is in Sri Lanka. And I want to say, I think it's Dragon Stout is another tropical stout. And I think that one is produced in Jamaica. So, usually fruitiness in those beers is coming from higher levels of ester content. If I had to hazard a guess, it might be because fermentations are conducted a little bit warmer, but I don't know that for sure. That's just kind of what I would assume. So yeah, Tropical Stout is kind of a weird niche style, but there are a few examples of it out there, and they're really interesting beers and really delicious. If you haven't had one before, it's worth at least keeping your eyes peeled and trying to find one if you are out shopping for beers. And the best way to look up examples of the style, I would say, is just to look at the BJCP guidelines and see what they recommend as commercial examples. Arturo asked if you would recommend having Sweet Stout for breakfast. If I was drinking beer with breakfast, this would maybe be one that I would go for. I think due to sort of the coffee parallels, people drink coffee in the morning. If you're going to drink a beer in the morning, this might be one to have. Founders makes a beer called Breakfast Stout that has, it's not a sweet stout. It doesn't neatly fit into any category. I think they brew that with both chocolate and coffee, but I have certainly had that beer in the earlier hours of the day and enjoyed it. In general, when I think about beers that work well in the breakfast brunch range, a lot of times and maybe this is just a lack of creativity, but a lot of times they're beers that sort of line up with other brunch-like beverages. So you have, something like a milk stout standing in for coffee, or other common beverages that people will pair in brunch settings are like wit beer or Weiss beer, which, especially wit beer, there are parallels you can draw there with like orange juice. So I would say if you're trying to do like brunch pairings specifically, you could definitely be a little bit more creative than that and do something interesting. But in general, if you're trying to find a brunch beer, I don't think you could go wrong with a beer like this. Let's see. Eric asked, how different would a sweet stout without lactose be from a Baltic porter? Even a sweet stout without lactose, the balance is still going to be more towards sweetness. And Baltic porters, while they're not terribly bitter, are not balanced quite as sweet as sweet stouts. The biggest difference, though, is that Baltic porters usually are significantly stronger. You're looking anywhere from, I think the BJCP specs are like 5.5 to 9.5% alcohol, something like that. But a lot of Baltic porters are falling at least 6.5 or 7% alcohol at a minimum. So significantly stronger. Also, those often feature a little bit of kind of like, I find a lot of Baltic porters lean away from roast even more and kind of lean into like a little bit of molasses or dark and dried fruit character. So let's see. Frank asks, nitro versus CO2. This difference is really large to me. They're like two different drinks. How can CO2 and nitro be in the same category? Does BJCP have different categories? I agree with your statement. Like nitro, like a nitro version of a beer versus a CO2 version of beer, they're drastically different. It has a huge impact on the overall character of the beer. That said, in the realm of BJCP judging, no, they do not have separate categories for the two types of beers. And one of the reasons is that this is one of the only styles that I think you really do see both versions of. In the case of Irish Stout, it's almost always nitrogenated. For most other styles, they're almost always regularly carbonated. You see breweries play around sometimes, like I've seen Imperial Stouts on nitro, or Oscar Blues sells Old Chub, their Scotch ale. They sell a nitro version of that. Those are unique. Those are novelties for sure. Sweet Stout is one of the only styles I can think of that really does have a significant number of examples of both regularly carbonated and nitrogenated. And they are pretty different. But, styles in general allow for some amount of variation. And so, that's one point of variation that might exist between two different examples of that style. So Greg said nitro version has significantly less mouthfeel than the CO2 version. I'm not sure exactly. Mouthfeel is sort of a blanket term for all mouthfeel sensations. So I don't know if you mean less body or what exactly they're saying. You said also, though, that the nitro has a more complex, rich flavor. Can you explain the mouthfeel component? So I'll talk just really briefly about nitrogenation versus less body. Okay, cool. I'll talk briefly about nitrogenation versus carbonation. And if you want more in depth, I'd say go check out that Irish Stout video, because I talked about it for some period of time in that one. So a couple of things. Carbonation does a better job of carrying aroma compounds out of the beer. CO2 bubbles pop more readily than nitro bubbles. Nitro forms kind of like a more of a dense, compact head over the beer, which to some extent even traps aromas in the beer a little bit. So in nitrogenated beers, usually the aroma is a little bit less intense. From a mouthfeel perspective, you'd expect the nitro beer to be sort of creamier, and part of that is the lack of carbonation present in the beer. Part of that is that since you get this kind of nice creamy head on top of the beer, every time you take a sip through that head, it creates the impression of like creamy texture. I use Guinness as an example a lot because if you just drink the liquid, like liquid Guinness, it's really, really thin. But when you drink Guinness through the head that sits on top of those beers, the head itself imparts sort of a creamy texture to the beer. In terms of the body seeming less full, one of the things is that with more highly carbonated beers, when you take a sip of them, the carbonation kind of like bursts out of solution on the palate, and it can cause the beer to froth up and sort of fill your mouth. And so that can sometimes make the body of the beer feel fuller than it actually is. I haven't done this with this beer in particular, but one thing you could do to kind of try to assess the body of the two side by side is take the regularly carbonated one, and this is totally weird and like not something you would ever do when just trying to drink and enjoy a beverage. This is purely like a for fun experiment, trying to learn more about how these things work. Take the regularly carbonated one, like take a sip of it and like swish it around a bit, which will cause all of the carbonation to come out of solution, and then like open your mouth to allow, because you will get like buildup of gas in your mouth. Once you've knocked a lot of the gas out of the solution, try moving the beer around your mouth then, and pay attention to kind of like the viscosity and resistance to flow, because that's really what body is all about. And then do the same thing with the nitrogenated beer. And like I said, I haven't done that with these two beers, but I would guess that if you do that, after you've knocked a lot of the gas out of the carbonated version, I would imagine they're probably more similar in character than when you're just taking a sip of them. But that, this is not something I would expect anybody to ever do when they were just drinking and enjoying the beer. And so that does illustrate the impact that like the carbonation would have on that beer, in that when you're just enjoying the beer and having sips of it, you have the experience of fuller body, fuller mouthfeel, just because of the carbonation like filling up your mouth. Let's see. David asks, when would a brewer add lactose in the brew process? Early or late in the boil, or question mark? My understanding is that most brewers would probably add sometime during the boil. But I have read also of brewers adding lactose post-fermentation to dial in or adjust the exact level of sweetness that they wanted in the finished beer. So could go either way. I imagine, I'm not sure which one is more prevalent, but if I had to guess, I would guess that more brewers are adding it hot side than are adding it cold side. But that's just a guess. Joan asks, what would a brewer use instead of lactose to achieve the same effect? So there are a few things that a brewer could do in instead of adding lactose. And the biggest things would have to be, like the things that come to mind for me are how they tweak the bitterness and their mashing parameters. So from the bitterness perspective, if they targeted a lower level of IBUs, that's going to increase the perceived level of sweetness, since sweetness and bitterness kind of exist in a balancing act within a beer. So by lowering the IBUs, they would increase the perceived sweetness. Another way that they could get some of the sort of like increased body and slightly increased sweetness that you see out of adding lactose, would be to have the saccharification rest of their mash. This is getting kind of complex. If anybody's like, I don't know what a saccharification rest is, like, don't worry about it too much. This is a complex question. But the saccharification rest of their mash, if they held it at a higher temperature, that would produce a less fermentable wort, basically by shifting the main enzymes that are working at those higher temperatures. You end up with a wort that has a higher percentage of unfermentable sugars in it, and that's going to lead to sort of like higher level of body and maybe a little bit more perceivable sweetness. A lot of styles that are sort of lowly attenuated or that have perceivable sweetness to them, one of the more common ways that brewers achieve that is through higher saccharification rests. Maybe we'll do another session sometime on amylase enzymes. I think I'm running short on time to really dig into that topic, but maybe at a future time. Patty asks, left hand calls out flaked barley as an ingredient. Is this for head/foam? Not 100% sure. You know, I know that, like, because I remember reading this in a lot of homebrew resources and homebrew texts, is that like flaked barley was a really important part of Irish stout recipes because it would lead to like fuller body and those sorts of things, or would lead to better foam retention. And in learning more about kind of how the professional beer world views flaked barley, like it's an adjunct along the lines of like flaked corn. It's a sugar source basically. So it may contribute a little bit to that in that regard, but I don't know that they're necessarily using that specifically to try to boost foam retention. And Ian asks, does pasteurization or filtering have any effect on lactose? It shouldn't. Lactose is too small of a molecule to be removed by any filter that you would use on beer that I'm aware of. And pasteurization is just kind of quick heating. It wouldn't, like break down the lactose or convert it or in any way. So no, to my knowledge, no. And last but not least, I see in here Frank's question about why does peanut butter and jelly sandwich pair so well with the sweet stout, or are your pairing tastes off? I could see that working well. Chocolate and peanut butter is a natural combo. You've got fruit there as well. Like I would do a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with this beer. I can imagine that being tasty. So no, I don't think your pairing tastes are off. In fact, might have to try it myself. We'll see. So at this point, we've run through the questions. My beer is empty. Hopefully we've covered anything and everything you ever thought you wanted to know about Sweet Stout. We'll be off next week. Join us back here in 2 weeks to talk about Oktoberfest style beers. And then I hope I see you guys the week after that to enjoy one of the least crushable but still quite delightful styles, American barley wine. See you guys soon.